ask my colleague Andrew Reynolds from the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jesse Kruschke. So Jenny did her, Jesse, sorry, very good friend called Jenny. Yeah. Very good friend called Jessie too. So Jessie did her undergraduate studies here at UW-Madison, and I remember realizing straight away when I first taught her in second year and third years of Russian classes and Soviet literature that she was an immensely talented student and a superb reader of literature. And then later, so we were delighted when she joined our graduate program. And then later when she taught us myself TA, I realized what a wonderful teacher she was as well. I'm sure people here can attest to that too. Jessie is currently completed a dissertation under the supervision of Professor Irina Shevchenko. And in today's talk, From Hughes to Baldwin, How Soviet Critics Read Black American Literature, Jessie will examine Soviet engagement, especially through the lens of literary criticism, and presumably implicitly or explicitly translation practices too, with Black American literature, and reveal some of the connections between Imperial Russian and Soviet approaches to race. In doing so, I suspect she may also show the various ways which the Soviet, and one may fairly argue post-Soviet, ideologies protest too much about their own lack of imperialist and racist agendas. So please give a very warm welcome to our speaker, Jesse Kruschke. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. I also want to thank CREECA for giving me the opportunity to talk about a topic and a particular time in history that has fascinated me for the past half decade that I've been working on the dissertation. This lecture is a distillation of several themes that form the basis of my dissertation, including, of course, the Soviet relationship with Black America, but also the way that one particular literary journal evolved over the decades in response to the needs and the desires of the Soviet state. I want to begin this story by talking about Langston Hughes in two different historical moments, two moments that were separated by 25 years, but connected by the consistency of Soviet literary criticism. In 1932, Hughes was the subject of a lengthy critical essay by Lydia Filatova in a Soviet journal dedicated to foreign literature called Literatura Mirovой Revoluции, or Literature of the World Revolution, which was a precursor to the more well-known journal of the 30s, Internatsional'naia literatura, or International Literature. In her analysis of his work, Filatova practically coaches Hughes in print on how to be a proper revolutionary poet. She evaluates his literary career as a kind of hero's journey, a narrative of political maturation, tracing his evolution from what she calls a captive of the notorious Harlem tradition toward revolutionary consciousness. She's telling him and Soviet readers that his work is progressing in the right direction, moving toward the correct ideological worldview. And this is prescriptive criticism. Filatova is not just assessing what Hughes has written. She's producing instructions for what and for how he should write next. Filatova closes her essay with the statement, "We are for revolutionary art that is national in form, proletarian in content." So in essence, she's directing Hughes to write about the specific problems of Black America, but only through the lens of class consciousness. It's a literary tightrope commonly found in much 1930s Soviet literary criticism, but it was especially applied to Black writers. Now, let's fast forward to the 1950s. By this time, Hughes had abandoned revolutionary poetry to write a series of autobiographies and an extremely popular satirical column for the Chicago Defender, featuring a fictional wisecracking Harlem everyman named Jesse B. Simple. Additionally, in 1953, Hughes testified before HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he publicly repudiated his past communist affiliations and renounced his more radical poems of the 1930s. And yet, in 1957, despite Hughes's well-publicized break with communism, Inostrannaia literatura, or foreign literature, the final, most popular, most enduring iteration of the previous two journals I mentioned, reprinted his 1930s poem Lenin in a special commemorative issue honoring the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. Same poet, completely different political moment. And yet, Soviet literary criticism keeps the earlier version of Hughes alive. The poem is reprinted in part because it fits the image that Soviet critics constructed for Hughes in the 1930s, an image that has been preserved, frozen in amber, that persisted long after the political ground shifted beneath it. That persistence and what it reveals about how Soviet criticism operated is the central concern of this talk. Soviet literary criticism of Black American literature was never only about literature. It was about constructing a usable representation of Black revolutionary consciousness, a narrative that could be deployed for Soviet ideological purposes. And the rules for constructing that representation, the formulaic reading practices, the prescriptive frameworks, those persisted even as the geopolitical priorities shifted dramatically between the 1930s and the 1960s. What I want to demonstrate today is that to trace the Soviet reception of Black American literature is, in fact, to trace the evolving self-image of the Soviet state itself. Black American writers became a mirror through which the Soviet Union could see and project its own moral identity. In the late 1920s and 1930s, that mirror reflected the revolutionary potential of the racially oppressed. By the 1950s and 1960s, it reflected something different: anti-racist moral authority, internationalist solidarity, a civilizational claim against American hypocrisy and warmongering. The critics changed, the writers changed, the geopolitical context changed, but the fundamental move, using Black American culture as a resource for Soviet self-construction, did not. To understand how this worked, we need to start with what the Russian scholar of American literature, Olga Panova, calls the flagship system. According to Panova, Soviet cultural policy required a specific kind of Black writer, one whose work would serve as evidence of growing revolutionary tendencies among Black Americans. This writer had to interpret racial oppression through a Marxist-Leninist framework and function as kind of a flagship for the oppressed Black American people. In other words, Soviet critics were running a kind of audition. They were looking for the ideal Black revolutionary writer, someone who could be held up as proof that the communist project was succeeding in awakening class consciousness across racial lines. And that audition produced a clear progression. The Jamaican-American poet Claude McKay was the first spokesman for Black literature in the 1920s, but he ultimately proved too ideologically inconsistent. Langston Hughes took his place in the late 1920s and early to mid-1930s, but he never quite became orthodox enough. And then Richard Wright emerged in the late 1930s, becoming what Soviet critics had been searching for: the paragon, the ideal Black communist writer. Before we get there, however, we will take a closer look at how this ideological molding worked, because Filatova's 1932 essay on Hughes is a perfect window into Soviet prescriptive criticism. However, I do want to take a brief moment. So before we dive into that closer reading of Filatova's essay, I want to note a continuity that predates the Soviet period. Using American racism as a mirror to reflect national moral superiority was not a Soviet invention. Imperial Russia had done the same thing, notably with the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The novel was enormously popular in 19th century Russia. It was translated multiple times, beginning in 1857, and widely read over the next 100 years, even becoming a primer for school children and, allegedly, one of Lenin's favorite books as a child. Russian audiences and intellectuals cited the novel as evidence of American hypocrisy, proof that the United States, with all its rhetoric about freedom, equality, and democracy, was built on the violent exploitation of enslaved people. But prior to the reforms in 1861 that abolished serfdom, Russian translators and publishers had to walk a careful line. They needed to show the horrors of American slavery without encouraging readers to think too critically about Russian serfdom. So early translations of Uncle Tom's Cabin portrayed the brutality of slavery, but they toned down the abolitionist rhetoric. They wanted the moral condemnation of America without challenging the social order and political economy of Imperial Russia. This is the same logic that we see in Soviet criticism of Black American literature. Use American racism to shore up claims of Russian superiority, curate and control representation to serve state objectives. The mirror metaphor I mentioned earlier has deep roots. The Soviets continued this practice and institutionalized it in their literary criticism. They just redirected it. Instead of proving the superiority of Russia's Orthodox Christian monarchy over a nominally secular American democracy, they were now proving Soviet socialism's supremacy over American capitalism. Now, back to our close reading. To return to 1932 and Filatova's critical review in Literature of the World Revolution, she doesn't just evaluate Hughes's writing. She narrates his entire career as the story of political awakening, a journey towards revolutionary consciousness. And she does so text by text, chronologically tracing what she presents as his inevitable evolution through his work. She begins with the poetry collection, The Weary Blues, which was published in the United States in 1926. The collection appeared in Russian a few years later, initially under the title Skучная синева, or Boring Blue. Thankfully, Filatova, who is also a translator, cites the collection more accurately as Грустные Blues. According to her, the poems in this collection show that Hughes is still beholden to the poetics of the Harlem Renaissance. He's aesthetically gifted, but politically inert. His goal, she claims, is to show white people that Black American culture is beautiful and capable of high art. According to her, Hughes exhibits in his early work a naive belief that whites, once they see the dignity and humanity of Black life, will overcome their prejudice and racial inequality will disappear. Filatova claims that stage 2 in Hughes's development occurs with his 1927 poetry collection called Fine Clothes to the Jew, which appeared in Russian as Хорошие вещи в закладе, or Fine Things in Pawn. In this collection, Filatova sees what she calls a serious qualitative change. Hughes has moved on from the syncopated hedonism of Harlem nightlife to depict the experiences of working-class Black Americans, servants, sailors, porters, and waiters. The stock images of the Black banjo picker, the soft shoe dancer, and the jazz club songstress are replaced by realistic portrayals of Black labor that's not tied to the entertainment of white people. Hughes's real breakthrough, according to her, occurs with his 1930 novel, Not Without Laughter. Filatova declares that with this text, Hughes finally breaks with the Harlem tradition and becomes a realist artist. It's his first novel, and she reads it as proof that he's finally moved beyond aestheticism and into social engagement. And finally, we have stage 4, his revolutionary poems of the early 1930s, including Good Morning Revolution, The Ballad of Lenin, and Open Letter to the South. And also includes his play, Scottsboro Limited, which was a protest against miscarriage of justice in the Jim Crow South. Filatova describes these works as a quote-unquote complete rejection of his earlier creative positions. Hughes's work has become fully socially oriented. He is writing about unemployment, economic crisis, the injustices of capitalism, revolutionary struggle, and the miracle of the Soviet project. The questions that troubled him in his novel, like how to achieve racial justice, she says, are resolved in these texts. He's found the path to Black liberation, and it happens to dovetail with the path of the international working class in the struggle for communism. And then Filatova delivers her prescription. She tells Hughes, and more importantly, tells Soviet readers how to evaluate his work, that Hughes's revolutionary poetry is brilliant, but now it's become too abstract, too internationalist. He's erasing his national and racial specificity. And this is where she gives him that formula that I mentioned earlier, stating, we are for a revolutionary art that is national in form, proletarian in content. She tells Hughes to maintain his uniquely Black character and style while serving class-based content. He ought to write about the specific problems facing Black workers in the United States, but he must always do so through the lens of Marxist analysis. It's a tightrope, and it reveals just how prescriptive Soviet criticism actually was. Filatova isn't just analyzing literature, she's providing instructions. A few years after Filatova's review, just after the mid-1930s, Richard Wright enters the scene, succeeding Hughes as the leading Black writer. Wright is everything that Filatova wanted Hughes to become. When Isidor Schneider reviewed Wright's collection of novellas, Uncle Tom's Children, or Dieti Diadipoma, for international literature in 1938, he declared, in the person of Richard Wright, American Blacks have finally found their own real writer. Wright checked every box: working class background, committed member of the Communist Party, deep knowledge of Marxist theory, and he wrote about the Black experience with unflinching honesty and rage. He was, in Soviet terms, the ideal proletarian writer. But what's fascinating about the journal's reviews of Wright is how much work they're doing beyond just literary criticism. Take Timofey Rokotov's 1941 review of Wright's novel Native Son, or Syn Ameriki, as it was called in Russian. On the surface, it's a straightforward analysis of Wright's work, but it's also performing two other functions simultaneously. First, it's an anti-Trotskyist shield. Rokotov uses his discussion of Wright to denounce Trotskyist critics of Wright's work, thereby protecting himself from the Purge-era scrutiny that had recently decimated the editorial board of the journal. In the extremely tense atmosphere of Stalin's Russia in 1941, any public Soviet intellectual writing about the sectarian left in America had to be very careful. Accordingly, Rokotov makes sure to align himself with the correct ideological position through vitriolic takedowns of those wrong-headed trots. Second, his review is a validation of communist organizing among Black Americans. Rokotov doesn't just praise Wright's novel. He uses it as evidence that the Communist Party is successfully building class consciousness among Black workers. The novel becomes proof of concept. This is what I mean by a multifunction review, one piece of literary criticism doing three jobs at once: analyzing the novel, protecting the critic, and validating Soviet ideology. And that's Soviet literary criticism in action. Richard Wright was the answer that Soviet critics had been searching for since the 1920s. He was the Black American spokesman they'd been trying to produce through their prescriptive criticism. And for a brief moment in the late 1930s and early 1940s, it looked like they'd succeeded. But then the ground shifted. The geopolitical context changed, the priorities changed, and the flagship system had to adapt. The tumult and the scarcity of resources faced by the USSR during World War II led international literature to shut down its operations in 1943. By the time that the nation had recovered enough to relaunch a journal that looked at the world beyond Soviet borders, post-war xenophobia and nativism made such a venture nigh on impossible. However, the death of Stalin swung that pendulum back to a renewed interest in engaging with the outside world. Nonetheless, when Inostrannaia literatura, or foreign literature, launched in 1955, the political landscape looked quite different than it had in the 1930s. Soviet efforts to mold Black Americans into a revolutionary vanguard through the Comintern had failed. Many Black intellectuals, including Richard Wright himself, had broken with the Soviet project, following the betrayal they felt after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. Furthermore, Red Scare paranoia and McCarthyism had silenced or marginalized the American leftist press that once supplied the pre-war journals with original content and some of their critical commentary. Finally, the bipolar world that emerged after World War II left the Soviet Union looking for new fronts in the emerging Cold War. But here's what's crucial. The interpretive habits of the pre-war journals didn't disappear with foreign literature. The same formulaic reading practices, racism as a structural feature of capitalism, literature as an ideological weapon, the critic as a gatekeeper who teaches readers how to properly understand Black life, all of that carried over into the journal foreign literature. What did change was the emphasis. Class consciousness loosened as the central criterion. International solidarity and anti-colonial sentiment tightened. The mirror was still there. Soviet critics were still using Black American literature to reflect a particular self-image. But the image itself was evolving, from revolutionary vanguard to moral authority, from proof of communist awakening to proof of Soviet anti-racist credentials on the world stage. And nowhere is this clearer than in the transformation of the reputation of W.E.B. Du Bois. In the 1930s, Du Bois was dismissed by Soviet critics as a bourgeois liberal, too reformist, too distant from communism, too focused on race over class. He didn't fit the flagship model. But by 1960, he's receiving the Lenin Peace Prize from the Soviet embassy. What happened? 3 essays that appeared in Inostrannaia literatura, foreign literature, between 1958 and 1963 construct what I would call a composite myth, a carefully curated narrative of Du Bois as a scholar revolutionary, self-exile as universal citizen. These include Cedric Belford's 1958 tribute to Du Bois on his 90th birthday, John Pittman's 1962 essay, The Logic of a Life, which presents Du Bois's late life turn to communism as a secular conversion narrative, and Yevgeny Dolmatovsky's 1963 obituary, which celebrates Du Bois as a world humanist. The title of Pittman's essay gives away the game, the logic of a life. Du Bois, according to him, is his joining the Communist Party at age 93 is not presented as a radical break from his past, which, to be fair, it wasn't exactly. Rather, Du Bois' transformation from bourgeois liberal to committed communist in the eyes of the Soviets is portrayed as the logical consummation of a lifetime devoted to truth. His entire biography is retrospectively reorganized to make that final step seem inevitable. This isn't so much about Du Bois changing. Du Bois was always Du Bois, a consummate social scientist and intellectual who crafted his moral identity from empirical observation and allowed his politics to evolve as evidence demanded. This is more about the Soviet Union changing what it needed from Black intellectuals. By the late 1950s, they didn't need revolutionary militants. They needed internationalist moral authorities, figures who could validate Soviet anti-racism on the global stage, especially as decolonization was transforming Africa and the so-called Third World was becoming a crucial Cold War battleground. And this brings us to the Soviet pivot towards Africa. After World War II, especially into the 1950s, Soviet geopolitical strategy was dramatically different. Black America was no longer positioned at the forefront of world revolution. Instead, it was Africa that became the site of potential transformation. The 1957 World Festival of Youth and Students brought Africans from over 40 nations to Moscow. The 1958 Tashkent Conference of Afro-Asian Writers connected developing nations with Soviet literary institutions. The founding of the Institute of African Studies in 1959 and Patrice Lumumba University in 1960 reaffirmed the USSR's commitment to building ties with the decolonizing continent. Between 1958 and 1964, foreign literature published over 200 items by or about African writers, far exceeding their coverage at the time of Black American literature. Du Bois was perfect for this moment. His Pan-Africanism, his late life move to Ghana, his articulation of a global anti-colonial struggle, all of this made him far more useful to the Soviet project in the 1960s than he had been in the 1930s. Now, this pivot towards Africa was not entirely new. The Soviet interest in Africa echoed an earlier Tsarist relationship with Ethiopia, although for very different reasons. Imperial Russia had cultivated ties with Ethiopia as a fellow Orthodox Christian nation, positioning itself as a protector of common faith peoples. Of course, the famously godless USSR was courting post-colonial Africa as a sphere of revolutionary potential instead. But the underlying logic and the attitude were the same. Russia, whether Tsarist or Soviet, was positioning itself as a paternalistic shepherd to distant oppressed peoples, using those relationships to shore up claims of moral superiority against Western powers. So returning to Du Bois, even a figure with his impeccable credentials, Communist Party member, Lenin Peace Prize winner, was not immune to Soviet editorial manipulation. Du Bois wrote a poem called Ghana Calls, or Ghana Zabuot, in 1960, celebrating Ghanaian independence and Pan-Africanism. It's a powerful poem, and it already does everything Soviet editors would want. It celebrates anti-colonial liberation, it critiques American racism, it centers Africa as the locus of an awakening world. But when Yevgeny Dolmatovsky translated the poem into Russian for foreign literature, he deviated from the original in interesting ways. For example, in the second stanza of the poem, Du Bois offers a relatively neutral description of the way his childhood peers were confused about his racialized appearance. There is bemusement and the innocent ignorance of children confronted with difference. The Russian version replaces those lines with language claiming his peers teased him, called him ugly, and were merciless and cruel. And Du Bois was not shy at any point about calling out American racism. However, in this particular instance, Dolmatovsky inserted it where it was previously absent. But it is the eighth stanza that is the most striking. In the original, Du Bois writes, "I went to Moscow. Ignorance grown wise taught me wisdom. I went to Peking. Poverty grown rich showed me the wealth of work." This is already quite positive with regard to the Soviet Union, but Dolmatovsky expands this into extra lines that recast the entire East-West divide as a battle between light and darkness, with Moscow as the source of liberation itself. "I went to Moscow, and there I was able to see with my own eyes the miracles born. Darkness turned to light. Freedom itself appeared to me, and from Moscow to Beijing lay my journey." Oops. Uh-oh. The original poem already accomplished Soviet goals, but the text was still manipulated to intensify the anti-racist sentiment, add messianic imagery around Moscow, and to recast a political journey as an experience of spiritual enlightenment. Translation, in other words, remained a site of ideological work. It had served this function in the 1930s, but in the 1950s, the tools were adapted to the needs of an increasingly binary global political reality. And this brings me to one of my favorite and one of foreign literature's most revealing features, the From Month to Month Chronicle section. These were short news briefs organized in alphabetic order by country that occupied the last 20 or so pages of each issue of the journal. They discussed a wide manner of developments in art and literature abroad. There were film reviews, mentions of art exhibitions, theater debuts, commentary from actors, directors, artists, musicians, writers, and so on. This segment is also where the journal could acknowledge writers who were too dangerous or politically complicated to actually publish. Here, James Baldwin's fiction is often discussed in brief, non-committal summaries. A 1963 blurb in this section even mentions that his novel, Another Country, was banned by racists in the United States. While this novel was reviewed in the Soviet journal, as we shall see later, funnily enough, Another Country would not be fully translated into Russian until the year 2000. So it was banned in the USSR for all intents and purposes, and for decades longer than it was in the US. Richard Wright also, he became a persona non grata after leaving the party, but he had still been too important to the Soviet literary canon, and he loomed too large even then in the literary world to ignore outright. So the psychologically driven existential work he wrote while in Paris also gets mentioned, but the journal never reprinted it. While Lorraine Hansberry's play, Raisin in the Sun, was very well received in the USSR and even performed a few times, her more ambiguous, less racially driven plays, like The Sign and Sidney Brustein's Window, are noted as interesting, but dismissed and also never printed. This is a newer strategy. The 1930s version of the journal simply didn't publish what it couldn't handle, but the 1950s journal found a way to gesture towards the full landscape of Black American literature, thus maintaining the cosmopolitan image it claimed for itself. It could fulfill its promise to readers that it would remain aware of world literature, while also carefully controlling what those same readers actually encountered in its pages. It was acknowledgement, but without endorsement. It was visibility, but without access. It's a more sophisticated version of the gatekeeping that we see in the 1930s, adapted for a moment when complete silence on these writers would have been too obvious to Stalinist. And that brings us to James Baldwin, the figure whose work exposes the limits of this entire system. Baldwin occupies a more unstable position in Soviet literary criticism than did Wright or Hughes. He was one foot on either side of the line Soviet critics drew between socially meaningful realism and politically inert modernist subjectivism. And Soviet critics themselves knew it. They genuinely admired Baldwin. Nikolai Kurdumov acknowledges his brilliance. Raisa Orlova praises his fiery temperament. His journalistic essays are celebrated for exposing what one critic called the cancerous tumor eating away at modern America. Baldwin, the essayist, works perfectly within the Soviet framework. He's militant, he's eloquent, he indicts American hypocrisy with devastating clarity. His essays can be absorbed, cited, deployed as evidence of American racism, but Baldwin the novelist becomes more of a problem. Let me read you how Raisa Orlova describes Baldwin's novel, Another Country, in her 1965 review. She says the novel is, quote, suffused with a suffocating atmosphere of despair. Baldwin's characters drink incessantly and stumble past one another as if in hell. The novel is a terrible scream of suffering, hatred, and despair. And then she connects this to jazz. Jazz, for Orlova, is the voice of the modern capitalist city. It supplies the frantic, cacophonous rhythm that reinforces Baldwin's vision of alienation and moral disorder. Now, what's happening here is crucial. Orlova isn't wrong that Another Country is dark. It is. But her reading transforms Baldwin's existential focus, his psychological depth, into a political liability. The novel's interiority, the characters' inner lives, their emotional complexity, their ambiguity, all of this becomes evidence of what she calls Baldwin's dangerous immersion in bourgeois pessimism. Introspection, in other words, becomes a substitute for political analysis. Baldwin's focus on individual suffering threatens to isolate that suffering in the realm of the personal, transforming structural violence into private psychic pain. And that, for Soviet critics, is politically disabling. Nikolai Kurdyumov's 1964 review of Baldwin's play Blues for Mr. Charlie, which was actually printed in this journal, pushes from a different angle, but arrives at largely the same conclusion. Kurdyumov doesn't reject Baldwin's literary power. He acknowledges the play's force, but he faults Baldwin for ignoring the possibility of Black and white unity. He points out that white progressives were marching on Washington, going to Mississippi to register voters, and putting their bodies on the line for Black equality. And Baldwin's play, in Kurdyumov's view, fails to acknowledge this interracial solidarity. Kurdyumov's critique is revealing. Baldwin's emphasis on personal crisis and moral torment, he says, reflects an intellectual mood characteristic of bourgeois society. The danger for Kurdyumov is that Baldwin's focus on existential doubt diverts attention from systemic forces. Introspection undermines the development of collective consciousness. Existential pessimism fosters resignation rather than resistance. Now, this is the interracial solidarity criterion in action, one of the nested models of solidarity that Soviet critics valued. They wanted literature that depicted solidarity radiating outward from family to community to class to interracial cooperation to international unity. Baldwin's writing, especially his fiction, doesn't perform that work in the way that Soviet critics want. It stays interior, it stays ambiguous, and that ambiguity for them is intolerable. Baldwin's instability becomes even clearer when you set it against the near total absence from the journal of one of the United States' most notable Black writers, Ralph Ellison. His novel, Invisible Man, was one of the most celebrated novels of the 20th century. But Soviet critics found in it precisely what they deemed politically disabling. In that same 1965 review I mentioned, Orlova describes Ellison's prose as, quote, a world of extremely subjective associations, a world on the verge of delirium, pathology. And her verdict? Behind the picture of life created by Ellison, there is no idea of transforming the world. Ellison and the later Wright, after he broke with the Communist Party, function as boundary markers. Their exclusion from the journal Foreign Literature defines, by contrast, exactly what the journal needed Black literature to do. It had to offer a path forward. It had to suggest transformation. It had to move from diagnosis to prescription. And Ellison's modernist experimentation, his psychological complexity, his refusal of didacticism, none of that fit that model. And then there's jazz, a distinctly Black American art form that was summarily ignored by the very journal that purported to have its finger on the pulse of significant international art. This was the era of classic jazz albums, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, Charles Mingus's Ah Jazz was also intimately connected to the civil rights movement. It was politically engaged, emotionally raw, improvisational, and alive. Yet, beyond Orlova's negative characterizations in her review of Black writing, there was no other mention of American jazz in the journal Foreign Literature. Nothing. No reviews of albums, no profiles of musicians, no discussions of jazz as a form of Black cultural expression or political resistance. Why? Because jazz could not be controlled. Literature can be managed through translation, through interpretive prefaces or forewords or afterwords, through critical framing. You can manipulate a Du Bois poem through translation. You could write an introduction to a Hughes story that told readers how they should understand it. But music, especially improvisational, emotionally charged music, resists that kind of control. Jazz is too immediate, too visceral, too open to interpretation. It can't be annotated and it can't be explained away. The jazz silence is the clearest example of where Soviet cultural gatekeeping hit a wall when it came to solidarity with Black America. So what does all of this tell us? The continuity across these two eras, from the 20s and 30s to the 1950s and 60s, is not in the specific formulas. Those shifted as geopolitical priorities shifted. Class consciousness loosened, international solidarity tightened, the flagship writers changed, the acceptable themes changed. Even the translation strategies became more sophisticated, but what persisted was the underlying logic. Soviet literary criticism of Black American literature was never really about the literature itself. It was about using Black American writers as a mirror through which the Soviet Union could see and project its own moral identity. In the 1920s and 30s, that mirror reflected revolutionary potential. Black American literature was evidence that the communist project was awakening class consciousness all across racial lines. The flagship system was designed to produce proof that the luminaries of Black America were evolving towards revolutionary maturity, proof that the Soviet model was working, proof that international solidarity was real and growing. By the 1950s and 1960s, the mirror reflected something different, not revolutionary potential, but moral authority, not proof of communist awakening, but proof of Soviet anti-racist policies and ideology. Not the vanguard theory, but internationalist solidarity and anti-colonial legitimacy on the world stage. The critics changed. Filatova and Ropotov gave way to Orlova and Kurdyumov. The writers changed. Richard Wright was celebrated and then exiled from the canon when he broke with the party. W.E.B. Du Bois was dismissed and then reclaimed when he became useful. James Baldwin was praised as an essayist, but condemned as a novelist. Ralph Ellison was excluded entirely. The geopolitical context changed. Comintern's ambitions gave way to Cold War competition for the Third World. The journals changed their names, their editorial boards, their publishing strategies. But the fundamental move, using Black American culture as a resource for Soviet self-fashioning, that did not change. So, to sum up, to trace the Soviet reception of Black American literature is to trace the evolving self-image of the Soviet state itself. What Soviet critics needed from Black writers tells us far more about Soviet ideology than it does about Black American literature. The mirror ultimately reveals the viewer and not the subject. Thank you.